George Patterson had never known life outside of the farm. For him, the sun rising over the vast fields of corn and soybeans was not just a daily event but a reminder of the generations that had come before him, each planting, tending, and harvesting the land that was passed down to him. His grandfather, his father, and now he, George, had lived a simple, honest life. The work was hard, but it was steady, and he was proud of what he had built. The land was his connection to his roots, a living testament to the sweat and sacrifice of his ancestors. His farm, located on the outskirts of the small rural town of Hillsborough, had been in the Patterson family for nearly a century. Every inch of it had been cultivated, cared for, and expanded upon. The house he lived in had been his father's before him, and the barn that stood at the edge of the property had been built by his grandfather. George was in his late 60s now, his hair salt and pepper and his back slightly hunched from years of bending over the soil. But despite the signs of age, he moved with a quiet determination. Every morning, just before the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, George would begin his day with a cup of coffee and a walk through the fields. It was his time to reflect, to think about his crops, and to consider what needed to be done. But on this particular morning, something felt different. As he walked toward the barn, he noticed an unfamiliar truck parked at the edge of his property. The vehicle was a dark green SUV, its windows tinted black. George squinted, his hand shielding his eyes from the morning sun, and noticed the flashing lights of a police cruiser behind the truck. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen a police officer in this part of the county for months, and with good reason. The town of Hillsborough was small, and most of the law enforcement activity was centered around the nearby city. But something about this felt wrong. As he approached the truck, the driver's side door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. He was wearing a crisp police uniform, but his expression was anything but welcoming. George had never seen him before, but he didn't need to know his name to sense the tension in the air. "Good morning," George said, his voice steady but cautious. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over George with an assessing gaze, his eyes scanning the older man from head to toe. "Are you the owner of this property?" the officer asked, his tone flat. "Yes, I am," George replied. "What's this about?" The officer pulled out a clipboard from the front seat of the truck and began flipping through a stack of papers. "We're conducting a routine inspection of local farms," he said, still not looking up, "just making sure everything's in order." George raised an eyebrow. "Routine inspection? I've been running this farm for over 40 years, and I've never had an inspection like this. What exactly are you looking for?" The officer finally looked up, his eyes cold. "Just standard compliance checks," he said. "Make sure you've got the proper permits for your equipment, that your pesticide use is within legal limits, nothing out of the ordinary." George frowned. "I've got all my permits in order. If you want to look around, I'll show you, but I've got a lot of work to do today, so if you don't mind, I'd appreciate it if we could get this over with." The officer didn't move. Instead, he just stood there, studying George for a moment longer. "We'll be taking a look around, Mr. Patterson," he said. "It's our job to ensure everything is compliant. If you've got nothing to hide, there's no need to worry." Something in the officer's words didn't sit right with George. The man's tone was too firm, too dismissive, as if he had already made up his mind about George before even stepping onto his land. It wasn't the first time George had encountered the kind of prejudice that ran through small-town America, but it was the first time it felt this palpable. Before George could respond, the officer waved his hand, signaling to two other men who had been standing by the police cruiser. The other officers were younger, dressed in the same uniform, and seemed to be just as disinterested in any pleasantries. "I'll be back in a few," the officer said, his words clipped. "You stay here." George watched as they walked toward the barn. His gut told him that this was more than just a routine inspection. He had seen enough of the world to recognize when things weren't right, but he wasn't sure what to do. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but he had never been in a situation like this. He turned toward his house, his mind racing with questions. Was this some sort of mistake, or was it something else, something more sinister? The officers didn't waste any time. Within minutes, they were going through his property, inspecting the barn, and taking notes. The process felt invasive, almost like a personal violation. George stood by the house, his hands clasped together as he watched them work. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the officers finished their inspection and walked back to their cruiser. The lead officer approached George again, holding a piece of paper in his hand. "You're being fined," he said flatly. failure to meet local pesticide regulations. It's a hefty fine. Mr. Patterson, we'll be sending the details to your address. George's heart sank. He knew the regulations, had followed them to the letter for years. This was a lie, a complete fabrication. But what could he do? He couldn't argue with them. They were the law. After all, they had all the power. The officer turned to leave, but before he did, he looked over his shoulder one last time. You should think about getting your affairs in order, Patterson, he said with a smirk. The next time we come around, it might not be so easy for you. The words lingered in the air long after they were gone. As George stood there, the weight of the officer's words pressing down on him, he knew this was only the beginning. He didn't know what the officers wanted or why they had targeted him, but one thing was certain, they weren't going to leave him alone. And no matter what, George wasn't going to back down. As the days passed, the weight of the officer's words hung over George like a storm cloud that refused to break. The fine was the first blow, but it was clear that it wouldn't be the last. The officers hadn't just come to check his equipment or make sure his farm was running in compliance with regulations, they had come with an agenda. And George knew that something far deeper than a mere inspection was unfolding. The following week, the same officer, the one who had led the inspection, showed up again. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 other officers accompanied him, and the same cold, calculating expression was on their faces. George was standing in his garden, the summer heat already pressing down on him as he worked the soil, when he saw the familiar green SUV pull up to the edge of his property. His heart dropped. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that the first encounter had been a one-time ordeal, but now, with the return of the officers, it was clear they had no intention of letting up. He wiped the sweat from his brow and set down his gardening tools, walking toward them with deliberate steps. "Good morning, Mr. Patterson," the lead officer said with a fake politeness that made George's skin crawl. "We're here for another check-in. Routine, as always." "Routine?" George asked, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "You've already done one of these routine checks. What's this about now?" The officer ignored his question, instead waving toward the 2 younger men behind him. They immediately began walking toward the barn, as if the entire property were theirs to inspect at will. "I told you before, we're making sure everything's in compliance," the officer said, his tone dismissive. "Just a few more things to verify, nothing personal." But George could see it in their eyes. There was something personal about this. He could feel it in the way they looked at him, the way their eyes lingered a little too long, the way they seemed to take pleasure in his discomfort. It wasn't just about the farm or the fine anymore, it was about power. And George, as a black man in this rural town, was an easy target. As the officers continued their inspection, George watched them with growing suspicion. They weren't being thorough, they were being invasive. One of the officers, a young man with a sharp jaw and an arrogant grin, walked up to the water pump near the back of the barn. He twisted the valve with exaggerated care, as if trying to make some point about negligence, before nodding to his superior. "Everything seems fine here, sir," the officer called out in a mocking tone. The lead officer gave a curt nod and turned to George. "Your water system's up to code, Patterson, but we'll need to come back next week to check on the pesticide storage. We've got new regulations we're enforcing now, and we need to make sure you're following them." George's blood ran cold. He knew the regulations. He had been using organic pesticides for years, far ahead of the mandated standards, but it wasn't about the pesticides, it was about control. "Do what you need to do," George said, his voice tight with restraint, "but don't come back here unless you've got a warrant. I've been nothing but cooperative, but this is harassment." The officer didn't flinch. Instead, he just gave a sly smile. "We'll see about that, Mr. Patterson, we'll see about that." George clenched his fists at his sides as the officers finished their so-called inspection. They didn't even pretend to take the work seriously anymore. It was clear they were just looking for something, anything, to charge him with. George had worked his whole life to keep his farm out of trouble, but now, it seemed, the trouble had found him. Later that day, after the officers had left, George sat at his kitchen table, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much worse was coming. The officers were relentless, but they weren't just coming for his farm, they were coming for his livelihood, his dignity, and they would stop at nothing to destroy it. He needed help, but who could he turn to? The town was small, and everyone knew everyone. People had their own lives to worry about. No one wanted to make waves. George had built his reputation over the years through quiet hard work, not by stirring up trouble. But now, he knew, silence wouldn't protect him. That night, As George lay in bed, a thought struck him. Maybe it wasn't just about him. Maybe this wasn't a personal attack on his family alone. Perhaps it was part of a larger plan, one that had been set into motion long before his encounter with these officers. Could it be that they were targeting him because of his race? Because he was an older black man with a successful farm in a town that had always prided itself on its old-fashioned values? The more George thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a fine or a code violation, it was about control, intimidation, and, perhaps, something far darker, the desire to force him off his land. The next day, George decided he couldn't face this alone. He went into town and found a small legal aid office, a place he had never had reason to visit before. He wasn't sure what to expect, but at this point, he was willing to try anything. Inside, he met with a young woman named Sarah. She was in her late 20s, smartly dressed, with an earnest look in her eyes. When George explained his situation, she listened carefully, her brow furrowed as she took notes. She was familiar with the area and with the kind of subtle, systemic racism that ran beneath the surface of everyday life in small towns like Hillsborough. But what George had described sounded like more than just racial prejudice. It sounded like an organized effort to push him out. "I've seen this before," Sarah said, looking up from her notes. "Police officers abusing their power to intimidate and extort. But this is different. We need to expose this. George, we need to show everyone what they're doing." For the first time in days, George felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could fight back. Together, they began to devise a plan that would not only defend George's farm but also take a stand against the corruption in Hillsborough. But George knew one thing for certain: the fight ahead would not be easy, and the officers, who had already shown their ugly side, would stop at nothing to break him. The following days felt like an endless loop of tension and uncertainty. George knew the officers would be back. He didn't know when, but he was certain they would return with even more force. The first inspection had been a warning, and the second had been a subtle threat. But this time, George was prepared. He wasn't going to let them push him around anymore. The thought of his father's words, passed down through the generations, echoed in his mind: "Never let anyone take what's yours. Stand firm, and they'll see the strength in you." George had always carried that advice with him. His father had fought for what was right, and George knew that now it was his turn to do the same. The sun had just begun to set when Sarah called. Her voice was tight, urgent. "George, they're here again." George's stomach dropped. He had been expecting this. It was as if the officers had been waiting for him to let his guard down. They had learned enough about his routine, enough about his sense of safety, and now, they were prepared to escalate things further. "I'm on my way," George said, hanging up without another word. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. This time, he wasn't going to let them intimidate him. He was ready to take a stand. As he made his way back to the farm, George's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It wasn't just about the fine or the supposed violations they had fabricated. This was about something much larger, about standing up to the system that had treated him, his family, and people like him with such disdain for so long. By the time George reached his farm, the officers were already there. The green SUV was parked in the same spot as before, and the familiar police cruiser was parked beside it. This time, however, there were more officers. At least 5 of them stood by the barn, their arms crossed, watching him closely. George's pulse quickened as he got out of his truck and approached them. The lead officer, the same man who had been at the farm before, met George with a smirk. "Good evening, Mr. Patterson. We need to finish up some business here." "I told you before, I'm not cooperating with any more of this," George said firmly, his voice steady but rising in volume. "This has gone far enough." The officer laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You don't get to decide when this is over, Patterson. We've got our orders. You're just going to have to deal with it." George's fists clenched at his sides. "I've done nothing wrong. You're just harassing me because of the color of my skin and because you think you can get away with it." For a moment, the officer looked taken aback. He hadn't expected George to push back like this, but his surprise quickly turned to anger. "We've been more than patient with you," the officer snapped. "You'd better start thinking about your future. Patterson, you're already on our radar. You don't want to make this any worse." The tension in the air was palpable. George felt the weight of the officer's words like a punch to the gut, but this time, he wouldn't back down. He had his family to protect, his legacy to defend. He wasn't going to let them bulldoze everything he had worked for. "I've had enough of your threats," George said, his voice growing louder. If you want to take me down, you'll have to do it legally, because I'm not going anywhere, not without a fight." At that moment, Sarah appeared, standing beside George. She had come to offer her support, but she didn't say a word. She simply stood by his side, ready to back him up. "Mr. Patterson is right," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "If you have any legitimate concerns, you need to go through the proper channels, but intimidation and harassment won't get you anywhere." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked from George to Sarah. "You think you can make a difference here? You're both out of your depth." George stood tall, his posture unwavering. He wasn't going to let this officer's threats get to him. "You've underestimated me for the last time, and you've underestimated my rights. I'll make sure the whole town knows what you're doing." With that, George turned and walked toward his house, determined not to let the officers provoke him any further. The officers stood motionless, watching him, but none of them dared to follow. The next few days were eerily quiet. George half expected the officers to return with more aggression, but nothing happened. The tension lingered in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. But each day that passed without an incident felt like a small victory. George didn't know if the officers were just waiting for the right moment, or if his defiance had finally made them reconsider their approach. But just as he was beginning to feel a sense of relief, an unexpected knock on the door shattered the stillness. George opened it to find Sarah standing there, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. "They've taken it too far now," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "You need to see this." George followed Sarah to the town square, where a crowd had gathered. There, in front of the local grocery store, was a large, defacing banner. The banner read, "George Patterson, thief and fraud, not welcome in Hillsborough." It was clearly a coordinated effort, one designed to shame him and turn the town against him. George's heart sank. He knew that this was a direct attack on him, an attempt to ruin his reputation and drive him out of town. But it wasn't just about the banner. The officers were clearly behind it, trying to paint him as a criminal in the eyes of the community. The sight of the banner felt like a punch to the gut, but instead of feeling defeated, George felt a new sense of determination rise within him. They were trying to break him, to force him to submit. But this was no longer just about his farm or his family. This was about something larger, something that went beyond one man and one town. George turned to Sarah, his resolve firm. "It's time we take this fight to the next level." The days following the appearance of the defamatory banner were some of the hardest George had faced. The townspeople, once cordial and respectful, now looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and the warmth of his community seemed to evaporate overnight. But what struck him most wasn't the cold stares or the gossip, it was the realization that, in the eyes of many, he was already guilty. The officers' tactics had worked. The defamation campaign had poisoned the well of trust. But George Patterson wasn't a man who would go quietly into the night. He had spent his life working the land, building his farm from the ground up, and he wasn't going to let it all crumble because of a few racist cops with too much power. The banner, the threats, the constant harassment, they had awakened something in George, an unshakable resolve to fight for his name, his land, and his dignity. The first step was to meet with Sarah and put a plan into motion. He couldn't go up against the officers alone. The odds were stacked against him, and the fight would be long and grueling. But together, with Sarah's legal expertise, they would have a fighting chance. That evening, George and Sarah sat down at the local diner, far from the prying eyes of the officers who had made his life a living hell. Over cups of coffee, they strategized, carefully considering their next moves. Sarah's plan was bold. It involved reaching out to local media outlets, collecting evidence, and, most importantly, turning the tables on the corrupt officers. It was risky, but George knew that there was no other choice. The time for silence had passed. "We need to expose them," Sarah said, her voice firm as she outlined the strategy. "We'll start by gathering testimonies from people who've seen the officers' behavior. I'm sure there are others who've been targeted but are too scared to speak out. Once we have the evidence, we can go public. We'll show the town who the real criminals are." George nodded. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. They would have to make the officers feel the weight of their actions. Over the next few days, Sarah worked tirelessly, interviewing residents who had experienced similar harassment from the officers. She uncovered multiple instances of abuse. Small towns often hid these kinds of things. But once the lid was lifted, the stories poured out. George's resolve strengthened as the evidence grew. It wasn't just him. The officers had been doing this to others for years, preying on people who had no voice to stand up to them. Now, George would be their voice. But George was still troubled. While Sarah gathered the legal ammunition, he knew that the officers would not back down easily. They had already demonstrated their willingness to escalate things, to go to any length to crush him. He wasn't naive. He knew they could retaliate. Then came the night he received the phone call that made his blood run cold. It was the sheriff's office, and it wasn't just an update. "Mr. Patterson," the voice on the other end of the line said, "we have a warrant for your arrest. You're being charged with theft and fraud. The evidence we've gathered is more than enough." George's heart pounded in his chest as the words sank in. It was happening, just like they said it would. They were going to arrest him, but George wasn't about to go down without a fight. He slammed the phone down and stormed out of his house, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. He called Sarah immediately, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "They've done it. They've gone too far. We're not giving up." "George," Sarah responded, her voice unwavering, "this is exactly what we've been preparing for. We'll turn this around. Trust me." The next morning, the officers arrived at George's farm to arrest him, but when they pulled into the driveway, they were met with an unexpected sight. The local news van was parked at the edge of the road, its camera crew standing by. Sarah had managed to get the media involved, and now the world was watching. As the officers stepped out of their vehicles, the pressure of the situation was palpable. They had underestimated George. They had thought they could intimidate him, silence him, and make him disappear. But now, with the media watching and the weight of the town's suspicions mounting, they knew the tide was turning. George stood at the front of his farm, his chest puffed out with determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person in this town who had been silenced, for every injustice that had been swept under the rug. This was bigger than him. The officers approached, but when they saw the cameras rolling, their steps faltered. George, with Sarah by his side, stood his ground. "If you want to arrest me," he called out, "you'll have to do it in front of all these people. No more shadows, no more secrets." The officer in charge, the same man who had been at George's farm from the beginning, scowled. He had hoped this would be quick and easy, but now the situation was spiraling out of control. They weren't prepared for this level of scrutiny. "Mr. Patterson, you're under arrest for theft and fraud," the officer said, his voice tight with frustration. "Come with us peacefully." But George wasn't going to make it easy for them. He raised his hand, signaling for the cameras to focus. "Arrest me all you want," he said loudly, "but know this, I'm not the criminal here. You are, and I'll make sure the whole town knows what you've done." As the officer reached for his handcuffs, George stood tall, resolute in his defiance. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he would no longer be silenced. With the media present, the officers had no choice but to proceed carefully. Any misstep, any hint of force, would only make them look worse. But as the officers struggled to maintain their authority, the story had already begun to spread. Word of George's defiance and the corruption of the officers was out. It wouldn't be long before the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. In the end, George didn't just win this fight. He had taken on a system that tried to break him and had come out stronger, more determined, and more resilient. The battle wasn't over, but he had shown the world what he was made of.